Now, here's another point. A study from the American Psychological Association is giving new weight to this argument. This month, it published a key study. It says people who commit mass shootings tend to have pathological narcissism. That means they seek notoriety in the news. So who is right and why does it matter? I talked earlier to a distinguished panel. Bruce Shapiro is executive director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and Jeffrey Dvorkin is a lecturer at the University of Toronto. He's also the director of its journalism program on the Scarborough campus. Let's start with Bruce. I started out by asking him, do journalists have an obligation to name the perpetrators?
Well, look, this is never going to be an easy question. And a lot of the controversy around naming shooters has come up because too often the news media has focused exclusively on perpetrators or gotten so fascinated by the kind of remarkable evil represented by mass shooting that we neglect whose story it really is. Victims, survivors, those immediately affected. We need to pay more attention journalistically to those folks. But I don't think that withholding names per se is going to prevent any violence. There's no evidence, really, that naming names contributes directly to mass shooting. And the fact is that the public does need to know who mass shooters are.
Jeff, does the public have the right to know who these shooters and killers are?
The public, I think, has the right to know who these shooters are, but only after it's been established, in fact, who they are. I think one of my concerns is that in a digital environment, there's a lot of misinformation and occasionally disinformation spread out by the internet largely, occasionally sent out by authorities wanting to appear to be in control when in fact they're not. And media organizations, news organizations have an affirmative obligation to make sure that they're getting the facts right and they're not being spun.
Where do we draw the line here? Let's say news organizations are correct and the name they have is 100% accurate. So if you don't name the shooter, where do you draw the line? Do you name his religion? Do you name his nationality? Do you talk about his manifesto and his writings?
Well, you're raising huge issues. I don't think that the shooters who clearly want the oxygen of publicity, it's not the job of the news media to feed that oxygen, but it is the obligation of news organizations to give the public the information they need to know. And journalists are making choices all the time. Sometimes they'll get it right. Most of the time, I think they try to get it right. Occasionally, they'll get it wrong. But they have to be aware that there is a tremendous pressure on them now to not name names because somehow this gives legitimacy to the killers. I'm not sure that that serves the audience either. Somehow we have to figure out a way to balance the need to understand what's going on, that the public has an insatiable curiosity, sometimes not always helpful, about these things, but that the journalists and media organizations have an affirmative obligation to give the public the information they need in order to be informed as citizens and not just as voyeurs.
Bruce?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that's really changed or become clear in the last few years is that journalists now are the curators of public consciousness and public understanding, where social media can feed an unending appetite for the sensational and the arousing and the scary and the exciting. And you can find out anything you want about a mass shooting, a mass shooter, and look at it over and over again and delve as deeply as you want into it. What we as journalists are trying to do is sort out what's relevant, what in the immediate run helps law enforcement and the public calibrate its immediate response, what helps the judicial process calibrate its response, and what helps the public and policymakers calibrate the long-term implications of terrorist incidents, of mass shootings, of all kinds of very distressing events. Again, I think the issue is not really naming names, but coming up with a kind of survivor-centered, trauma-informed journalism that never lets the public forget whose story it is that is at the heart of this, that doesn't sensationalize perpetrators for their own sake.
And speaking of sensational, I just want to ask you, both of you, about the cover of Rolling Stone magazine a few years ago. After the Boston Marathon bombing, the magazine put one of the killers, one of the suspects, on the cover. And frankly, a lot of people said it glamorized this person, and it sort of made him look like a teenage heartthrob. Bruce, should there be a different standard for television reports versus newspapers and, of course, the blogosphere?
Well, I think we all have standards. I think that television, the blogosphere, everybody needs to be aware of the enormous power of our storytelling, okay? And there's power in different ways. One is the power to cause distress to victims and survivors and their broader circle of friends and acquaintances, or distress to people who already are emotionally vulnerable. There's also the power to influence other people with problems, other violent people, other angry people. There is no doubt that perpetrators of some very important mass violence incidents have studied past events. So, one mass shooting studies another, and we need to know that the information we're putting out there, just as we do with suicide and with other issues, can have a lot of effects on a lot of people.
All right, a final question for both of you. We're running out of time. What is the solution here? Where do we go from here? I know there are clearly areas, gentlemen, you agree on here.
I think that too often news reporting is still trapped in the sensational breaking news phase. And frankly, I think some of the pressure around naming names and other issues would fade away if we did a better job of covering aftermath, of covering the long-term impact of terrible tragedies. I think that would ratify the experiences of survivors, would connect communities that need to be connected to one another after traumatic events, and would help prevent us from getting stuck in this endless feedback loop of violence and perpetrators and more violence and more perpetrators and graphic images and graphic audio and more violence and more perpetrators.
Jeffrey?
I agree. I mean, the problem is that as audiences become more fragmented, media organizations are trying to frighten their audiences into watching them. It's no wonder that people are being driven to cat videos to get some kind of relief from all the horror that they're seeing, certainly in mainstream media, but also on the internet. We have to do a better job.
Gentlemen, thank you. Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and Jeffrey Dvorkin, Lecturer and Director of the University of Toronto's Journalism Program. We appreciate it.
Thank you,
Asieh.
Asieh.
Pleasure.